Hi, everyone, and welcome to Larger Stories Book of the Month webinar. I'm your host, Kep Crabb, and I'm joined with a special guest today, a man who is considered by many to be one of the finest writers around, the author of, I believe, over 25 books. I'm joined today by Philip Yancey. Good morning, my friend, and thanks for joining me.
Good morning to you, Kep. It's great
How
to
are you
reconnect
doing?
again. I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
Good. Well, before we get started, I got to say, on behalf of my mom, who I think is tuning in with us right now, she wanted me to say hi to you and to Janet before we get going. So let me get that out of the way just to make sure I don't get in trouble with her for anything. So
yes,
Mom,
well,
hello.
we were in a small group for years with both your mother and your father, and lived through some of the hard times that your dad went through health-wise.
Mhm.
And boy, he weathered that for years and years before finally succumbing, and that was a great loss. But they were quite a pair, those two. And your
Similar to you
brother,
and your wife, similar to you and Janet, I would say.
absolutely, yeah. Spunk is the word that comes to mind when I think of your mother.
Well, the last time you and I got a chance to see each other was actually at Dad's memorial service here,
Right.
here in Denver. And I guess just to kind of give people a little context, I knew you guys a little bit through the small group that you were in with Mom and Dad for a while, but I also got to know you guys a little bit through the church. Kimmy and I went to the same church with you and Janet for, I think, a decade or more. We were at the church there in Evergreen, and
you went there when it was in its thriving days. It went as much as 1,000, even 1,200 around Easter time. We still go to that church, Kep, and there are about 30 of us left. we meet in the hallway of a private high school, and folding chairs and the whole bit. So we could tell you stories, and I could tell you church stories, and sometimes I do, but it had its moments and still does.
Well, I do remember the heyday times, and I think I actually got a chance to lead worship one time when you were speaking, and that was fun, and some of that kind of stuff. So, but it's interesting because I feel like I actually know you a whole lot better now after having read your book, which is the memoirs. You said in the book too that this was one of the more important books that you felt like you were called to write. And I see such connection between Dad and yourself just in, the Philadelphia piece where, Dad was born and raised in Philly and just outside of Philadelphia in Germantown. And then the thing that really caught me was Columbia Bible College, CBC, where Kenny and I spent hours and days and weeks on the ping pong tables that you were talking about in that comments there.
Yeah, well, I carefully avoided actually naming it. Now you've blown my cover. But so, but that's all right.
I did also see the Bible college, but
you can find anything in the internet. There are no secrets.
Well, I knew it was, and I remember spending probably 5 or 6 summers there where Dad was an adjunct professor.
Right.
We would go down there, and Kenny and I were just young, and we would play tennis and just ride bikes all over and play ping pong for days. But the interesting thing about your memoirs for me was the similarities that you really drew, that it drew in my mind between my grandfather. And I know you knew Grandpa Crabb a little bit, but his father passed away when he was 5 years old. And he and Dad wrote a book called God of My Fathers, which was kind of a story about his life. And I guess my first question for you, bro, is what was it like writing your memoirs? I mean, when you're sitting down and telling stories, especially the first piece of your book is stories that you don't have any memory of. These are all things that you got from either newspaper clippings or aunts or mom or all the different ways that you heard about your father and what was really going on. What was it like to actually put that in a book?
Yeah, well, I've been planning this for decades, actually, and have always resisted because I felt that the close family secrets would really damage people if I got them out there. And actually, we can talk about this later, but the reverse has happened. It's kind of brought my family together in a different way. And my fears about exposing my my family have not been realized. When I was writing it, I tend to go out into the mountains, as your father used to do, and get away and unplug and do my real writing out there. And whenever I would leave, my wife would know what I was going to write about that week. And she would look at me and say, "Are you okay? Are you ready for this?" And when I would come back, she'd say, "Are you all right?" Expecting me to need a psychiatrist right away. but actually I found it therapeutic because well, I guess I would just say I look at my life now through a redemptive lens.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's pain, there's suffering, there's family disruption, there are unresolved things out there. But God has given me a strong faith where I look back on it as uh, a time, a temporary time that led me to eventually to maturity and to a solid faith. And you're right, my father died when I was just a year old, so I have no memory of him at all. But later I got a surrogate father. I wrote 3 books with Dr. Paul Brand,
Mhm.
and he became kind of a father figure for me. He was we had about the right age gap. And I decided in some ways that's better to get to choose your own father. And I chose a really great man, a saint really. And I
Yeah.
was able to spend all the time I needed just probing him, asking him the questions that I had. We didn't have to go through that rebellious teenage phase that, a real father and son have to go through, but which you know a little bit about, Kep. And
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
yeah. Well, you're exposing my secret, so I can expose some
There
of
you go.
yours.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. But it really was not a painful experience, the writing. It was
Yeah. Sounds freeing.
yeah, it was like reclaiming territory.
Yeah.
All these pieces in the book I mentioned, it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle,
Mhm.
but I didn't know I had no picture on the cover to guide me. So I
Yeah.
just had these pieces, the things that happened to me in life, trying to fit them together and see if there's a pattern. And there clearly was a pattern, and it's a pattern of some suffering, yes, but a lot of grace. And I was able to write with that grace in the foreground, and that's what I'm grateful for.
You said you were a little worried about perhaps exposing some of the Yancey secrets or whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously you spoke a lot about your brother, Marshall, and it sounds like the exact opposite happened of what you possibly were anticipating, and that you say it brought you guys together. What does that mean?
Okay, there was a rift in our family, and I describe it in detail there.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of a crazy scene, actually, that my mother would go so ballistic over something like my brother choosing to go to Wheaton College, but that was kind of the break, the disruption. And she
Weeks of silence.
Yeah, not only
And
disowned
then
him.
blow up.
And it wasn't weeks, Kep. It was 51 years. For 51 years, they had never heard each other's voice. He took off, went to California like most hippies of the day, and has stayed there ever since. And they've had a few contacts by letter. He doesn't usually respond, but has once or twice. She'll write him a letter, and it's mixed. It admits that maybe she should have done things a little differently, but no real direct apology.
Yeah.
And she is now 98 years old. So last year when she was 97, I was turning in the manuscript. I had already turned it in. It was too late to make any changes.
Right.
And she called and said, do you think your brother, she calls her son your brother, and he calls mother your mother.
Mother. You are the link, it would seem.
She said, do you think he would talk to me? And I said, well, I don't know. I'll ask him. So I called, and he said, okay. I said, are you sure? It could be pretty tense. That's all right. So I got him on a 3-way phone conversation, and it didn't go particularly well. There was some profanity on one end, and she didn't really apologize. And she put in some threats about, hell is a long time and things like that. And I would just say, mother, this conversation has to end. You'll never reach Marshall through guilt and shame. He's fed up to hear with that. He would only hear, really, I'm sorry, from you. That's about the only word he can hear. Led to 3 conversations in all, and it wasn't a kumbaya moment where we all came together, but at least they were talking. First time in 51 years. Imagine a mother and son not hearing each other's voice for that long a period.
This was obviously after you had written the book, because that was part of the book in there.
I'm too late to make any changes. It was typeset.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and maybe that's a protection. But then, most astonishingly, she got a letter or a card, like a greeting card, and it had 3 words in it: I forgive you. Mm-hmm. Which I never would have predicted, because I hadn't seen that coming in my brother at all. but it just shows that even when we think the story is over, God can surprise us. The story is not over. Even my own personal story, which I thought had hit a wall there between the two of them, well, even those walls can
Yes.
at least start to come down. Little cracks appear here and there. They still haven't seen each other in person and don't have any regular contact, just these kind of extraordinary moments of coming together, which I usually monitor. But in fact, even last night, she wrote one more letter. She's now 98. She isn't going to be around here that long, although her mother lived to 102.
Wow.
And she sent me a letter and said, would you please call your brother and read this letter to him? Because if I send it to him directly, I'm not sure he would read it. So I did. And he claims to really not have much emotional reaction. Just says,
Yeah.
that was a long time ago. That was like a different lifetime.
Marshall seems pretty hard. Is that a good word, or is that because I mean,
Yeah,
I wonder what this has done to you and his relationship. You know, I'm a brother. I've got a little brother. You're the
yeah,
brother. Marshall's the older brother, but
yeah.
sounds like, is he still wheelchair bound? And
He has learned to walk. He walks with a cane.
okay,
He has learned to drive. He has one of those adapted
okay,
vehicles with the pedals reversed,
yeah,
because
yeah,
he doesn't have much use of the right side of his body.
sure,
So he lives on his own and gets by. You use the word hard, I would say hurt, and often they're confused.
okay,
I think he was deeply wounded, just that primal rejection. Of course, he had no father, although he had a few memories. He was 3 years old when our father died.
think,
And then a mother who was rather harsh and legalistic, and
yeah,
then actually said she would pray for his death. I mean, that's pretty severe.
yeah,
And there was always a tape in my brother, a different tape, and I don't know where these things come from. Kep, you may have had the same thing with your brother. My Marshall's tape was, "You're a screw up. You're going to mess everything up. Why keep trying?" So even though he had this incredible brain and incredible musical talent,
yes,
there was always that little tape saying, "You're never going to make it. You're never going to make it." And his life kind of was a way of living that out, that doubt, that self-doubt. Whereas mine, I faced some of the same challenges. He went before, so he absorbed a lot of the trauma and the fighting and things like that. And I learned just to turtle down. And my response was, I'm going to show them one day. I'm going to show them one day. And I don't know where these tapes come from. And I mean, it was just the way I viewed the world, with the way he viewed the world, and our trajectory kind of lived that out, and in some ways still does.
Do you think some of that had to do with the fact that you guys didn't really have a father at that, on those really formidable years?
Yeah, I'm sure it does. God had a good idea with two parents, a male and female. I don't care what the researchers say. There are differences between men and women, and and you both need that father who lets you fall off the bicycle because you got to learn your lesson that way, and you also need the mother who puts you back together and puts the band-aids on after you fall off the bicycle, and you need the father who is a little stern, but when you're not turning out like you should, you need the mother who says, "I'll accept you regardless." And we certainly didn't have that. It was almost like, "I'll reject you regardless." So we really lacked that. And I was just recently in a prison, celebrating Prison Fellowship's anniversary in Northern Ireland, and the stats on criminals, something like 90% of all men in prison were raised without a father.
Yeah.
90%, much higher than the actual population raised without a father. But there's something that a father feels that we need in growing up and maturing that some people never get, and I was one of those.
But I think what's interesting, I look at my dad, who had his father. Obviously, what Dad did to Kenny and me was priceless. I mean, you talk about the tape that runs in your head. It was always that encouraging word of "you're kept crab," and you the Lord loves you, and I mean, just the potential that's there. And he just was so encouraging. But yet, you didn't have that. But you guys both still ended up in the same place. And I know where Dad's place is now, so that's not what I'm talking about. but I mean, your journeys were on polar opposites, but yet you still a lot of people kind of connect Crab and Yancey in terms of how you guys write. You're both wordsmiths. You both have put out a bunch of books. You've published a ton of books. You're prolific writers, and but yet you came from such different areas. But where you've ended up is just the work of the spirit, which I think is just so neat to see. And to
yeah, we both were raised in, I don't know if your dad ever would use the word fundamentalism about the subculture in which he was raised. Probably. I mean, I think it was the school he went to, and his parents were really strict. And I took a survey one time on former fundamentalists, and it had all these true or false questions. And at the end, I realized I had a lot more gratitude for it than resentment. The gratitude was for things like I learned the Bible. I mean, the Bible college I went to, I learned the Bible, and your dad and his writings expressed it all the way through.
Oh, he
relied on it completely.
He said he read the Bible like we have to breathe.
Yeah,
it's literally
good. Yeah. And we learned discipline, and we learned that things matter, that the decisions we make, the way we act, has eternal consequence, eternal significance. That's an amazing lesson to learn. And fundamentalism maybe have gone a little too strong, because they filled in the blank of the things that God disapproves of. And later I found out, God doesn't really care whether I read the Sunday paper or not,
Or if the Broncos win the game yesterday.
Well, maybe God does care about that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And so I'm more grateful than resentful. And I concluded, if you survive, if you get through the weird stuff, don't go bowling because they might sell alcohol, don't dance because don't go roller skating because it looks like dancing, these kind of funny rules. If you survive that and don't emerge on the other side with a great resentment toward it, you're in good shape. And I remember when I first experienced grace, when I first took my gulp of grace and really realized that God loved me, that God was not that policeman in the sky, that God was a force just trying to break through my own hardness and express complete, utter acceptance and love for me, who deserved the opposite. That's transforming.
Oh, man.
The problem is not everybody survives.
Yeah.
And that's why I told my brother's story in some depth, because the more like the Pharisees we are, the more we're going to push people out the other side. Totally. And that fundamentalist subculture in America had some very good things about it, but it was always a little risky, because they didn't come across as full of grace. They came across as moralistic. You got to toe the line. You got to get God to like you by doing these various things. I mean, whether it wasn't taught in that explicit a way, but that's the message I had as a child.
I think Dad really balanced that with my brother and myself in a really good way. One that I think told us the severity and the seriousness of things, but also, the grace impact and what really is our role, because our roles are small.
Yeah.
It's funny. I've got a friend who just thinks you're one of her favorite authors. She really has enjoyed your writings, and is rereading some of the stuff now. But she's working with Larger Story, and I had asked her if she could join us today. And Roseanne Gridley is going to join us, and she's really, just so you know, Philip, she's responsible for why we're chatting today, because she said, "Okay, Cap, I really see a lot of similarity between When God's Ways Make No Sense and there's memoirs that Philip Yancey wrote." And I said, "Oh, wow." I said, "Well, I know Philip. Maybe he'd be willing to do a webinar with us." And then I said to her, "Would you be willing to join us?" And she's like, "What?" And I said to her this morning, I said, "I've seen it before with Dad in many ways, where people go up and they're, 'Oh, Dr. Crab, we're just so honored to meet you,' and stuff." And Dad said, "Please just call me Larry." And he just never looked at himself in that regard. I think you're the same way, Philip. You're just a down-to-earth guy who happens to be spirit driven and given a gift of being able to write and convey some thinking. So I just want to introduce you to Roseanne right now. Roseanne's a good friend of ours.
Hey, Roseanne.
Hi, Philip. I'm so excited. I have been reading, it's funny because I have been reading your book, Disappointment with God,
Hmm.
and um, and Larry's book, Inside Out, came out when I was 16. And I can remember I had a regular babysitting gig, and I took both of those books with me to read after
Hmm.
I was done with my homework after the kids were in bed. So
Interesting.
I've been reading
You
both
must
of
have been in a pretty tough time, Carly,
yeah, I
Roseanne.
was so much fun at parties, let me tell you.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, when we were in this small group together, Ken Davis, the Christian comedian, was in that group as well, and he kept calling Larry's book "Insides Out" because he said that's what it did to him. It turned his insides out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting, Philip, because Roseanne, I think when you talk about this fundamentalism piece, I think can really that resonates with her in a lot of ways. And Roseanne, talk a little bit about what some of the overlap that you saw
Mm.
in these two books. The When God's Ways Make No Sense, which I know Philip did a little endorsement for that.
Sure.
But then also with what Philip wrote with his memoirs, what were some of the key areas that you saw some of that overlap?
Well, to answer that, let me back up and say where I see overlap with my background and
Mm.
yours, Philip, because I've lived my whole life in South Carolina and Georgia. Many of the pastors that you referred to were speakers on the circuit in the church that I grew up in. So
Mm.
and I was you spoke at homecoming while I was there as a 19-year-old wrestling with health issues. And it was
Mm.
there that you said at college and in college chapel, I can remember all these years later, you shared the story of Karen Burton Maines asking you the
Mm.
question, do you ever just let God love you, not be proud of you, not teach you, not give you insight, whatever? Do you ever just let him love you?
Mm.
And I'm tearing up even as I'm talking
Mm.
about, because I still have the tape from that chapel message.
Mm.
Um, it it was the beginning of an unraveling for me, of that, of my relationship with the Lord changing from one
Mm.
of performance to
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah. I
Um,
remember that scene very well, Roseanne. We were in an airport, actually. We were going to a meeting together, and she just popped this question out of nowhere. Do you ever just let God love you? And I realized, no, I don't. I immediately think of all the reasons God shouldn't love me,
mhm.
but God doesn't. Those are behind. There's that story that Brennan Manning tells, where somebody ask God about all the sins. God says, what? I can't remember. I can't remember. And that's actually biblical in Isaiah. That God puts our failures behind, and
Right.
as far as the east is from the west, it's gone. Even
Yeah.
God can't remember those.
Yeah.
That's so important.
Well, I think what the reason both your books and Larry's meant so much to me, and Larry gave me often a framework of thinking. Well, you both did it in different ways. Often the subjects that you touched on, one of you would give a framework of thinking about it, and the other would tap into the emotional aspect of it. Because for me, coming out of that very fundamentalist environment, and I would love to hear more about your journey with this, because I think it's a big thing right now. A lot of people are wrestling with, how do I unbundle all of the messages I've gotten in Christianity, some of which have been harmful and untrue, especially for those in a spiritually abusive environment.
Mm.
Um, but how do I unbundle it so it's not just an intellectual shift, but my heart is actually there. My heart can actually trust God again.
Yeah.
And I felt like your memoir really helped engage the heart. And When God's Ways Don't Make Sense was more of the theological framework. And that was the intersection that I saw between the two books. But
Hmm.
I would love to hear more about, how did that happen for you?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
deconstruction, deculturalization, whatever you want to call it, that unbundling.
Right. Well, in my case, I'm glad you bring up story. I'm looking at your icon here for the larger story, because that's how God deals with us. I mean, the Bible is 90% story. 10% of it is idea driven in the epistles, but most of it's story by far. And we are part of the larger story. That's why you guys exist, just getting that concept across and getting people to realize that. But all of my books until this memoir are idea driven books. I tell stories and use illustrations in there, but they're about ideas from here to there. And I have an outline before I write them. This one is different. And I didn't know how to write a memoir. So the first thing I do is go and try to read other people and see what I can learn from them. And I end up reading, I have a list. I ended up reading about 350 memoirs.
Wow.
And some of them were Christian, some of them were not. And there were memoirs about growing up Jehovah's Witness and Buddhist and all sorts of things. And what I found, the reason I just kept reading, that's all I read for about 3 years, just memoir after memoir. And some of them were bad books, not worth my time. And it would take me maybe an hour just to kind of go through them. But every single one of those books triggered a memory that I probably would not have retrieved if I had not read that book. And I think that's what story does. Why do you read? Who cares about my life? I mean, maybe somebody who's read one of my books finds it interesting to find the backstory of what was really going on. But what makes a memoir work is if it summons up the response within the reader. And actually, I think that's what makes a book work. Even the books of ideas, not just, we don't think, oh, what a beautiful idea, I admire that. We think, how does that affect me? How does that change me? So there's a dialogue going on in a good book between the author, who obviously doesn't know the readers yet because he or she is writing it. It's not published yet, but eventually there is going to be that dialogue. And I always ask myself, okay, this is my story, but how is it going to make that, bridge that gap between me and the reader? And in this case, for example, my target audience was people who didn't really survive fundamentalism. Because so many times I've been on, say, an airplane sitting next to somebody, and we exchange pleasantries. What do you do? Where do you live? What do you do? I'm a Christian author. And usually that ends the conversation right there. That's enough, okay. But occasionally not. Occasionally somebody will say, oh, that's interesting. I kind of used to be into that. I went to young life clubs. I went to summer camps and was really involved in my church a lot during my teenage years. And then I went off to university and kind of put that behind me. And I'll say, why was that? Well, it was the way the church treated this person or that person, or the way the church was saying something about science that I found out not to be true in university. You hear these stories. Often it's the way the church treats deviants, I guess, gay people, divorced people in some cases, just one story after another. And I lean back and kind of laugh and say, oh, it's a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story. and they say, well, I thought you were a Christian author. And I say, well, I am, but it would be a bad trade to give away the possibility of connecting to the God of the universe who created us because of the ways somebody treated somebody in your family 20 years ago in church. And so my story, and I feel really blessed to be able to say this, my story as a freelance writer, I don't have a board, I don't have I don't have to raise money. I just can write about whatever I want to. And what I've been able to do is just pick up the pieces of my past one by one, examine them, clean them off, and figure out what should I keep from this mixed past and what should I discard. So that's my story. And I don't tell that part in the book because I've already told that part in my other books, the other 25 books. Right. I tell why I can believe in a loving God, even though we have pain and suffering. I explain, okay, Jesus wasn't like the Sunday school cutout that I got growing up. So what is Jesus? The Jesus I never knew. And I didn't experience grace growing up, but later I did. What's so amazing about grace? I've been able to go back and revisit all of those stained parts of my childhood and kind of try to remove the stain and figure out what is worth keeping and what should I let go. So that's I just feel blessed. I mean, we weren't using the word deconstructing and reconstructing back then when I was doing that. Now that's a common word. And in a sense, everybody does that. Very few people have the same faith today that they had as a 5-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old. Very few. So we all do that. We go through that. The difference is I've made my living at it. You know, that's my job. I don't have another job. Most people have day jobs and then they think about God on Sunday or during private devotional time. I've got to work through that all day long and can go to the people who can really help me in that path. So that is a story that I'm so grateful to God to end up doing. It's not what I had in mind with my life, but I can't imagine another one looking back now.
Yeah. Wow. I think one of the questions that I'd have too, and I want to also say to some of our audience out there, we do have a Q&A button. We're limited in time, but if there's any comments or questions that you want to bring before Philip today, you know, if we have a chance to address some of those, we'd love to talk about that. But I guess one of the questions I would say too is, you know, when you look at the crab stuff, especially like when God's ways make no sense, and I think you've got books that are similar to that, but Dad really touches on kind of that theological, psychological kind of thing. I think he talks story as well so much, obviously.
Sure.
The whole notion of larger story was really what Dad was talking about 2 decades ago. And that's where this ministry has come from for sure. But with you, this was such an emotional book. This one seemed to really produce something, you know, it wasn't very deeply theological at some level. I guess it was at some level too. So I don't want to say that it wasn't, but all the emotions that came out of this as you were writing this, what does Marshall think about some of this kind of stuff now? I mean, you said that he kind of, and it's opened up some great conversation with him or some opportunity there perhaps, but I can see that being a little sketchy.
Yeah. I was terrified what my brother would think, because I tell the raw truth about his life, and it includes kind of kinky sex and drugs and LSD and all sorts of stuff. And it's true. And most of us have people like that in our families, the wider family, who just kind of push the envelope. What can I get away with? And in a sense, my brother was trying to prove how unfundamentalist he is. And he has successfully proved that. I think no one would really confuse him with fundamentalism these days. But I remember the days when he was devout and sincere and seeking, and he was much more desiring a relationship with God in high school years than I was. I was kind of turned off by a lot of the trappings of it. He was not. He was a true believer. And when I sent him the first manuscript, he's gone through several versions of it. He said he sat up all night and read it and was sobbing all night long. And there's that, what I was speaking earlier about what a memoir should do. It brings to the surface, you know, and in this case, it's his life that I'm writing about, but also my life and our family. And it just touched chords in him. And there were parts of it that were a little embarrassing. He wasn't sure, but he said, well, that's who I am. So let's be truthful. And he's given away a number of copies. He started giving them away even before it was published. I said, Marshall, you can't do that. You know, there's copyright, you know. Right. And but it's been great for us. And as I mentioned earlier, has helped open up some closed doors in the family. My mother is not able to read. She's mostly blind now. She's heard about it, and I think that may be behind some of her quasi apologies where she contacts Marshall and just says, I should have done things differently, which is her way of saying, I'm sorry. And she's actually used those words a couple times. I'm sorry. I think she has regrets. And I hope in the book, I think I come across with a sympathetic view of my mother. She was given a terrible lot in life. She had a worse upbringing than I had by her own mother and father. And then she met the Prince Charming, the man of her dreams. They were going to be missionaries, were going to do God's will. And then boom, he dies of polio, a decision that she has a part of because they remove him from an iron lung. And then she's left with these two little boys, 3 years old and 1 year old. She's never written a check. She's never driven a car. She just doesn't know how life works. She grew up in Philadelphia. Now she's in the middle of Atlanta of the 1950s, which is a very different place than the Atlanta now.
Yeah.
And she did the best she could. She often says that, and I agree. My mother did the best she could. And when people have reviewed the book, they use words like abusive and mental illness and things like that. And I never saw that. When you're a kid growing up, this is just the way life is. You know, my mother has moods. My mother can be harsh. That's what you think. You don't categorize it. It's just, you live it, you confront it.
Wow, that's a great response. We're getting a lot of questions, Philip, here, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so let me dive into some of these that the people are asking now. But how did you come out of such deep hurts and wounds that came from your background, and what made a difference from you to what your brother's gone through? And why did you, and one of the questions I had that kind of tags onto this is a friend of mine who's asking this question. How did you stay the course? How did you stay in your faith and in some ways?
Yeah. Once again, I look back and I just feel so blessed because my only job, the only company that's ever given me a paycheck is Campus Life magazine, which later joined Christianity Today. And this was in the early 1970s, and the church was going through the 1960s. You know, we're always a few years behind. So yeah, we were going through the 60s in the early 1970s. And it was part of Youth for Christ. We had a lot of freedom. Jay Kessler, a man you may know, was the president of Youth for Christ, very gracious, wise, funny guy. And I had a wonderful mentor at the magazine. And then while there, just within a couple of years, I did team up with Dr. Paul Brand. And I wrote my first book was Where is God When It Hurts? And then in the process of doing that, I met Dr. Paul Brand, who was an orthopedic surgeon who worked with leprosy patients in India and then had a laboratory in the United States here. And for 10 years, I wrote books with him. We collaborated together, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, In His Image, and The Gift of Pain. And that, I look back on now, that was a cocoon period of my faith where I wasn't sure where I was going to come down. You know, everything was in suspension and I didn't know where it would end up. But I had this father figure. I couldn't have respected anyone more, that I could take all of my problems and go over them with him, all of my questions. And then after working with Paul Brand, in some ways simultaneous to that, I also was working on this project called the Student Bible. So for 3 years, I was paid to go all the way through the Bible, every word, and come up with an edition, kind of, we called it a study Bible for people who would never read a study Bible. And it was basically a kind of a beginner's way to get into the complex book that we know as the Bible. So that was a 10-year period. And if that had not happened, who knows where I would have ended up. But I look back and it just seems so providential now for me to end up at Campus Life, one of the few Christian organizations where I could kind of spread my wings and not get clipped for it. And then the relationship with Paul Brand, and then the Student Bible. Those three things together were really my formative period.
Wow.
And then we found this great church. You know, people read my story and say, man, I've never seen a church that bad. You know, well, what's a good church look like? Well, we found a really good one in Chicago, LaSalle Street Church, where it was defined by grace. It was full of diversity, PhDs and people from Cabrini Green, a housing project right down the road. My wife was a social worker. It's a church who cared about justice, who reached out to the city. And people cared about theology and following Jesus. That was the motivation for what they did. So I had that beautiful period of it really does work.
Wow, that's awesome. It's amazing to see the rest of your story. I thought I knew you pretty well, and I didn't know you at all. And I've got a couple more quick questions here, and then I know we're going to be out of time. But you've handled a lifetime of hurt. And this is a question you talked a little earlier today about how you've kind of gone back and kind of discarded different pieces, or you talk about the deconstruction and the reconstruction of the words you used. How do you the hurt that you've been free to decide what you can reconstruct and what you deconstruct, or what this person's asking is what you discard about your story. How do you do that?
How do you do that? I came up with a slogan that's almost been a mantra for me, Cap, and it goes like this: pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed.
Yes.
And that actually came to me as a journalist, where as a young kid, one of the first articles I did was an article on Johnny Erickson, this potential Olympic athlete who had this terrible disaster of a broken neck and quadriplegia. And then she had to live with that. And that was such a huge thing for her, because I met her right after, just a couple of years after it happened, and she's still ashamed and can't imagine her future. And now, more than 50 years later, she looks back and says, that was the best day of my life. Because otherwise I would have just cruised along trying to pursue the American dream. And now I realize I've been able to contribute. I've been able to do something for the church, to expose it to what God's care for the disabled, and to be a prophetic voice within that. And so I look at my own wounds, which I'm sure are still there, and I did revisit them in writing, but through that redemptive lens, pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. When it happens, we want to get rid of it. But the funny thing is, all the surveys show that when you ask people, at what time did you grow most spiritually, and even as a human being, they always talk about a hard time. Almost never, oh, it was when everything was going great, I got a raise, my kids were doing wonderfully. It was always, my kid was in jail, I was struggling with addiction. And that's when the rubber meets the road, and God comes through at those times, and we grow. In terms of—
That's the only way you can grow, Philip?
I'll let other people answer that. The only way I've seen.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know what the alternatives are.
I don't have Dad around anymore, so I'm going to have to start calling you up for some of these questions. I think Scripture would identify that as yes. That's the only way.
Yeah.
That's been my experience in the last few years with what Kimmy's been going through.
Right.
And so you just realize,
yeah, for sure,
there's more to this.
There is. And I always, to answer the other part about what to keep and what to discard, I really rely on other people. I wrote a book called Soul Survivor, which explores 13 of the people who most formed me. And as a journalist, I could go to people like Henry Nouwen and Frederick Buechner and in person and interview them and probe them. And again, I'm so blessed to be able to do that. Yeah. And I leaned on their faith when I was trying to figure out my own. I would say, well, it seems to be working for them, and I really respect them. And I look for people who were made larger by their faith, not smaller. The people I grew up with were trying to kind of pull in and keep themselves from being affected by the world around them. So they were made smaller. I look for people who were made larger by their faith. And I just feel blessed as a journalist to be able to do that.
Philip, you've been such an encouragement and such a blessing to so many. Roseanne, is there anything else? I know we're getting short on time here, but as we get ready to close, is there any other questions, Roseanne, or something you want to say before we wrap her up here?
I just want to say thank you. My therapist has informed me that on the scale of loss, I tip it pretty heavily in my life. And your books have been major companions, and I probably would not still be a believer today had I not read Question That Never Goes Away. At I hit a point as an adult, and it was funny because with everything that had happened prior to it, I had never really questioned the existence of God, but I hit a season where it was like, maybe I just believe because I was brought up to believe. And
Yeah.
I've looked at everything through that lens, and maybe this isn't true after all. And I need to really stringently evaluate that. And I read A Grief Observed. I read
Mhm.
the book, The Question That Never Goes Away. And I read the Gospels, because I figured if Jesus wasn't true, then like the whole thing was a crock anyway.
Mm.
So I needed to start there. And the statement you made in that book that stuck with me was that God had given us the Psalms, in the Psalms, the language of protest.
Mhm.
And that was what I needed, was to know he was even more upset about what I had suffered than I was.
Mhm.
I could endure it if I knew he was not clinically removed from it.
Yeah.
But that he was actually moved with compassion. So I just was,
Yeah.
thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Roseanne. Yeah, that's so important. When I've gone to places like Newtown, Connecticut after the Sandy Hook shootings, and Virginia Tech and Columbine, and it's so important for me to be able to say, you are grieving, God grieves more. You're upset with this world, God's more upset than you are. And I think that's biblical, but it's a message that a lot of people miss. And you use that word companion, which really touches me, because we who write, of course, we're not with the people that usually while they're reading, but we kind of hope we will have companions out there one day. And during the pandemic, I found this old book by John Donne, written 400 years ago, 1623. John Donne was the vicar of St. Paul's Cathedral, largest church in England. And then he, in the midst of their pandemic, the bubonic plague, he got what everybody thought was bubonic plague. And he lay there and he wrote this incredible book that's never been out of print for 400 years. No Man is an Island, For Whom the Bell Tolls. You know, we still read these kind of things in high school even. And I redid it. I just kind of took out some of the old-fashioned language and made it a little more accessible. And the title of it is A Companion in Crisis. And that's what we need. Some people are fortunate enough to have live, human, warm companions who are really helpful. That's what therapy is all about, right? And that's what friendship should be about as well. But some people don't. And it just moves me. And I think would move any author just to hear that at a time like that, there's something that we several years before, sitting in our office just trying to get through the day, trying to come up with words, they had an effect. We were a companion, an actual companion to a live human being. It means a lot. So thank you very much.
This has been really fun. I just want to say thanks so much, Philip, for joining us. I hope we can do this again. This was just a good time. And I know your schedule's busy, but we would be honored to have you back. And I did want to answer one quick question too, before we wrap here. You say in the book, when you start to talk about Janet, the last third or the last quarter of the memoirs there, when she comes in, and she said, I'm not sure what drew her to me. Well, I remember sitting with her at Thanksgiving, one of the many Thanksgivings that you had with us at Mom's house, and I was sitting next to her and I asked her that exact question. You were sitting right next to her on the other side, and I remember exactly what she said. Do you want me to tell you what she said?
Yes.
His mind, of course.
And I thought it was my body all this time.
Was it the long flowing locks of hair that he has, or anything?
No,
Philip, this has been so fun, man.
Yeah, she tells the story of typing my term papers. I would hire her to type my term papers, and so she thought, I like the way this guy thinks, and hey, whatever works, right, Kev?
You got it, man. Whatever works. Well, please greet her for all of us, and thank her for sharing you with us today. And folks, thanks for joining us today. We sure hope you have a safe evening tonight and great holidays coming up. Next month, I've just got a quick announcement here. On October 17th, we're going to be talking about The Marriage Builder, one of my dad's books, and I'm actually going to be interviewing my daughter and her fiance, who are getting married on December 2nd. So that's one that I'm kind of looking forward to. And they both just got done reading through The Marriage Builder. We gave that to them, Kimmy and I did. And so I'm going to get a chance to chat with them about the book and future things that are happening on the 17th of October. So please join us then. Philip, thanks again for joining us. Roseanne, always
Absolutely.
thanks you too, girl. We'll see you guys next time. Have a safe and happy Halloween.